To really understand a fight that's still going on today, we need to go back in time, back to a tense, armed standoff that happened decades ago, but whose roots go back centuries, all grounded in a long, painful history of broken promises.
So picture this. It's 1973. 200 indigenous protesters stage an armed takeover of Wounded Knee, South Dakota. And you have to understand, this was the exact same place where, less than 100 years before, the U.S. military had massacred around 300 Lakota men, women, and children. The symbolism was incredibly powerful.
And this thing was intense. The protesters and federal authorities actually exchanged gunfire. And it went on for 71 days. We're not talking about a one-day protest here. This was a full-on siege, and the whole country was watching.
So, with all the chaos and the media coverage, you have to ask, what was this all really about? What on earth would drive people to take such a risky, dangerous stand like this?
Well, it all came down to one thing: treaties. See, many of the protesters were part of the American Indian movement, you might know it as AIM. And one of their biggest demands was for the U.S. government to finally, after all this time, honor the promises it had made in treaties with Native nations.
To really get what they were fighting for, we have to talk about what historians call the treaty era. For about 100 years, this was the main way the United States, as it expanded, dealt with sovereign Native nations, through these formal written agreements.
And wow, did they make a lot of them. We're talking about nearly 400 different treaties signed between the U.S. and various Indian nations, and every single one of them represents a promise, a negotiation, and a piece of this incredibly complicated history.
But as you've probably already guessed, this whole story isn't exactly about promises being kept. In fact, to really see why things went so wrong, we have to go back even further, to the very beginning, and a huge clash of worldviews. Okay, let's take the famous story of the sale of Manhattan. On one side, you have the Dutch settlers. Now, like most Europeans, they saw land as a thing, a commodity you could buy, own, and keep forever. But for the Lenape people, whoa, completely different way of thinking. Land wasn't something you sold off for good, it was a resource for the whole community, something to be shared and used. They almost certainly thought they were just leasing the land, not selling it forever.
And this quote from Joanna Gorelick at the Museum of the American Indian just nails it. She says the problem wasn't the exchange itself, but what that exchange meant to each side. And that fundamental misunderstanding? It would be a problem in treaty talks for the next 100 years.
And you start to see this pattern emerge like right from the very beginning. The first treaty the U.S. ever signed back in 1778 with the Lenape promised them sovereignty. The Lenape kept their side of the deal. The U.S., not so much. And as the country got bigger, the whole point of treaties started to change from peace and friendship to being all about one thing: getting more land.
Man, this quote from the great Lakota leader Red Cloud, it just says it all, doesn't it? It's just such a powerful, heartbreaking summary of the entire era. The only promise that was kept was the one that was the most devastating.
Then, in 1830, this pattern wasn't just a pattern anymore. It became official U.S. policy. We're talking about the Indian Removal Act. This law basically gave the government, under President Andrew Jackson, the power to force any native nation in the eastern U.S. to trade their ancestral homelands for territory way out west.
Now, on paper, these removal treaties were voluntary, but let's be real. In practice, it was all about bribery and threats. And the forced relocation that followed of the Cherokee, Creek, and other nations became known by a name that tells you just how horrific it was: the Trail of Tears.
And the sheer scale of this is it's hard to wrap your head around. In the 1830s alone, you've got an estimated 100,000 Native American people forced out of their homes and marched thousands of miles away.
And the human toll was just catastrophic. It's estimated that around 15,000 people, men, women, and children, died on that journey west. They died from the cold, from disease, from pure starvation.
So as the U.S. kept pushing west, guess what? It started running into the very same peoples that it had just forced out. So this time, the government tried a different tactic. The policy changed from removal to concentration.
So first, in 1851, Congress starts funding a more formal reservation system, basically setting aside these small pieces of land for tribes. Then, and this is a huge deal, in 1871, Congress just decides, you know what, we're not making any more treaties with Native nations. Now, that didn't erase the old treaties, but it totally shifted the power balance and made those existing promises much, much harder to enforce.
And all of this brings us full circle, right back to where we started: Wounded Knee. because the history of the Lakota people and that very spot of land is a perfect, tragic example of this whole cycle of promises made and promises broken.
I mean, just look at this timeline. It's so stark. In 1868, a treaty creates the Great Sioux Reservation. But pretty soon after, the U.S. finds gold and other resources on that land and just takes it back. Tensions exploded, and it all led to that horrifying massacre in 1890. So when those AIM protesters showed up in '73, they weren't just picking a random spot. They were directly calling out the broken treaty of 1868 as the whole reason for their fight. It's a direct line through history.
And look, this isn't just some dusty old history lesson. This fight, this legacy of Wounded Knee and the treaties, it's still incredibly relevant today.
That 1973 occupation, a lot of people see that as the moment that really lit the fire for the modern movement for Native treaty rights. Using these old treaties became a powerful legal and political tool for Native nations trying to get their land back and protect their sovereignty.
And you want to talk about a living history? Get this, some of the same people who were at Wounded Knee in 1973, they were on the front lines at Standing Rock in 2016 protesting the Dakota Access Pipeline. The fight literally gets passed down from one generation to the next.
So all of this really leaves us with a huge question. Technically, these treaties are still the law of the land, even if they've been ignored for generations. So you have to ask yourself, when a promise is that old, does it make it easier to just forget about it, or does that make it even more important to finally make it right?